Yeah. Well, I mean, I've known Jackson Mthembu for a long time. And yesterday, it felt like I had lost my own brother. And I would like to express my condolences to the family. May the Lord be with them. Let me just say that, I mean, I knew him whilst he was young, so they know him from Parliament. But during the United Democratic Front days, when I was part of the national leadership, we used to meet people like Jackson Mthembu, who came from different parts of the country, and for him from Mpumalanga. And they were key in our struggle. They were committed. They were ready to risk their lives. They were tortured, detained, taken to prison, charged. But he kept on going. He never gave up on the way until, of course, he was so harassed that he came to Johannesburg because he couldn't stay in Mpumalanga anymore. And during that time, I worked closer with him. And he ended up being part of the communication system of the SACC when I was general secretary. And he was activist per excellence in terms of whatever task he had to undertake. And so I'm not surprised that at his maturing age in parliament, he would have been the peacemaker, the person who stood for the truth even when there was a crisis in parliament. There's a moment at which people wanted to compromise parliament, make parliament to violate its own rules, regulations, and even violate the constitution. And Mthembu stood up against the odds, even within his party, to say that this cannot be done. And for that reason, we thank God that we have had such a leader who has died whilst he was on his boots.
Yeah. And as you cast your memory back, and I'm sure some of those recollections are now flooding back slowly, what would you say it was about Jackson, the young activist, that kept him going?
Well, I remember that I worked with lots of activists during that time. So that's why I'm putting Jackson Mthembu as a typical case of an activist you could rely on in a particular region of the country until, of course, he couldn't survive there. And when he came to the SACC, the South African Council of Churches used to employ the best cadres in the country. It is from a church perspective, but they dealt with detainees, with families of detainees, with prisoners, and Jackson Mthembu was a fit for that type of task. We had about 56 of that type of activist who was employee of the SACC. And they did an extraordinary job. They went to risky places. They saved people. They helped people. And that's what you would rely on Jackson Mthembu. And that's why he ended up at the headquarters of the SACC and ended up with a project on Namibia. As you would know, that's the time when I got poisoned and etc. and so forth, 1988. And that's the mission on which Jackson was involved in.
Yeah, I mean, you speak about risky jobs. Many will argue the job he had to take on at the early stages of South Africa's democratic dispensation is one of them. Him being the spokesperson of the ANC, when quite frankly, no one was quite sure where the country was headed moments after 1994. That kind of task is certainly not for the faint-hearted.
No, as you know, I mean, when he went to the ANC to be communications officer, he would have come from the South African Council of
Yeah.
Churches. There was nothing during our days. There was no benefit except sacrifice your life for the struggle. There was no hope for the future in terms of the fact that you will be alive. You had a hope for the future you're fighting for and people dying for, but you didn't even expect yourself to be there. And so when he went to the African National Congress, it would be a culmination of that development, and he got into that space, played his role as a reliable cadre of the movement. And you couldn't actually say less about Jackson Mthembu.
Yeah, I mean, you allude to the idea of self-sacrifice. A lot of the reflections we've received now over the past few hours is a Jackson who didn't mind speaking the truth, even if it meant that would result in a fallout with some of his cadres. Great lessons to be learned as we grapple with all kinds of moral challenges in South Africa today.
Yeah, but that's the point I'm making. Actually, you should go back to Parliament, because that's where, for me, he proved his mettle. In the difficult days of the 10 years we went through, he was made the chief whip of the African National Congress. And it's during that time when the conditions in the country were worsening, state capture became worse, corruption became worse. He took a stand. By the way, if you are appointed a chief whip, it means the party trusts you. And he took a stand against his own party and mobilized the caucus to take a position against what was definitely completely unacceptable in Parliament. I realized that he was able to take a stand even against his party, because truth does not depend on party. In fact, party politics are the worst things we can have, because people oppose you just because you are on the opposite side. With Jackson, it didn't matter whether you are opposite or you are in his party. If you went wrong, he rejected that and took a stand.
Yeah. I mean, outside of his life as a political activist, Jackson himself faced quite a bit of adversity in his own personal life. We're learning now that, according to some of his colleagues in the parliament you mentioned, that is some of the things that helped him to be as empathetic a man as he was. Are you able to recall, your own interactions where that came across?
Yeah, I mean, remember that I worked with him at a time when we were about the people and the liberation of the people, dealing with victims, families, detainees, the people who were tortured before himself getting arrested. And he was you couldn't work in that environment and not be empathetic and have your heart in the lives of people rather than just yourself. Actually, it's a sacrificial approach. And that's why, even when given this task of dealing with this pandemic, he went out of his way, took all the precautions, but the risks remained there as he tried his best to help the nation, the people. And that's Jackson Mthembu. He really was ready to do whatever he could do for the people.
Yeah. And Rev, many people will, as we reckon with his passing, try to find some kind of moral direction about how we respond not only to the ANC, but, even respond to something like the pandemic. You, in many respects, are seen as someone who has always been able to provide that kind of moral reckoning. What would you say ought to be top of mind for us now as we try to carve a way forward insofar as that is concerned?
Our country, we must thank God that we have actually come back from the precipice. I mean, our country really nearly dipped over and just ended up being a banana republic with corruption, leaders who have no respect for the law, who were prepared to use people's money, who are very hungry, who are poor, use it for their purposes. We arrived at that point. And that's why I'm saying Jackson was the type of person who took a stand and took a risk. And many people in this country took a stand, took a risk, and we brought back the country from the precipice. But we still have a problem, because the consequences of that period are with us. And with losing Jackson Mthembu, it's a great loss to the nation. But I hope that he will motivate more people who will be prepared to take risks and make sure that our country continues to develop in the direction people who sacrificed for it meant it to be.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for your reflections. Certainly appreciated on the AM report. Reverend Frank Chikane is former Presidency Director General, also, of course, a struggle stalwart.